Of the Independent. So before we get started, I want to inform you that this session is being recorded and will be posted on the Joseph Rowntree Foundation website shortly. So do let us know in the chat function if you have any problems with us doing that. So a very warm welcome to everyone who has joined us for this year's virtual Labour Party conference for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation Fringe, with the title Building a New Generation of Good Jobs, Securing an Economic Recovery for All. So let's start with some context. This year has seen easily the biggest shock to the UK jobs market in peacetime, with some 9 million jobs furloughed because of the pandemic, almost a third of the national total. Now official projections show mass unemployment as the furlough scheme comes to an end in November, with a possibility of 4 million jobless. Now that would be worse than in the early 1980s recession, an experience that created massive economic and social scarring. So first and most obviously, the question is, how do we prevent that from happening? Second, how do we make sure that we not only prevent a surge in unemployment, but also ensure that we have more good jobs in the economy, jobs that pay enough for workers and their families not to live in poverty, jobs that offer security and training. Too many jobs going into the crisis did not do that. During today's session, we will be joined by Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Annalisa Dodds, the General Secretary of the TUC, Francis O'Grady, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's Director, Helen Barnard, and the Chair of the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Select Committee, Darren Jones. Let's take a quick look at today's agenda, which should be showing on your screens shortly. Yes, there we go. So that's what's going to happen over the next hour and a half. And here are some of the important issues and questions we're going to be addressing today. How fundamentally do we build a new generation of good jobs? How is securing an economic recovery for all dependent on good jobs? Which sectors, people and places are being hardest hit by job losses and why? What can mistakes made in previous recessions, including in the 1980s and the 2000s, what can we do to counter those mistakes happening again? And what is the role of public investment in driving a new generation of good jobs that provide people with opportunities to get on? And finally, how can we ensure that we act quickly to provide the training needed so that those of us worst affected can transfer into new roles? I'll quickly run through a few housekeeping rules for this session. Please use the hashtag GoodJobsRecovery in your tweets and tag JRF_UK and at Devo Connect to continue the discussion online. The panelists, please use the chat function if you want to share opinions and comments, from which I will be able to pick up your questions and offer them to the panel. Please indicate as well if your question is aimed at a particular panelist. That would be very useful. And panelists, please mute your microphones when they are not in use. Without any further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Annalisa Dodds, the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer. Over to you, Annalisa.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Ben. I'm really sorry to be late joining this. I think Labour conference itself is always a logistical challenge. Doing literally all of it online is part of what I think must be the world's biggest ever political conference totally online. Is a bit of a challenge, but it's really good to be with you all just now, and particularly to be part of this discussion, because I think it's obviously absolutely fundamental. This crisis really is laying, sadly, very bare quite how precarious and difficult so many people's working lives were before we even got into this period. And it's very, very important we do all that we can to deal with those problems in the future. I think, first of all, we need to recognise the fact that we've had the growth, obviously, over time, not just of, in many sectors, low pay, but also of low numbers of hours, both 0 hours, but also, of course, low hours generally. Employers really manipulating the situation, unfortunately, in many cases, making life incredibly difficult for people. And actually, right now, we see some major employers even stating to some of their staff, or indeed all of their staff in one particularly egregious case, that unless they can offer to be totally, fully flexible 24/7, they will not be re-employed after this crisis. So that kind of intense, precarious work has become, sadly, increasingly a feature of our economy. Of course, the TUC has shown, I'm really, really pleased that Francis is on this call as well, it's shown that 3.6 million people, or 1 worker in 9, were in insecure work ahead of this coronavirus outbreak. And in fact, as I was saying, we've seen this growing. So the Resolution Foundation's done excellent work on this, as well as JRF. They've shown that 2/3 of the growth in employment since 2008 has actually been in atypical roles like self-employment, 0 hours contracts, agency work. And what some have described as a self-employment miracle, actually, when you scratch the surface, very often is a low-paid set of jobs focused on drudgery, not delivering for people, very precarious indeed. Of course, also that's been coupled with that overall pay squeeze that we've seen over the last 10 years. So what do we need to do about this? Well, we would say, first of all, very, very obviously, we have to get a grip on the public health crisis in order to deal with the economic crisis. And that's fundamentally rooted in our workplaces, as well as in the rest of our communities. The TUC member unions have done absolutely incredible work during this period, but it has exposed quite how threadbare the health and safety infrastructure has been, and the kinds of problems that many of us may have been highlighting around, underfunding and lack of strength of the health and safety executive. They're really coming home to roost right now. So we need to see, I would say, particularly from government, much more engagement on these issues, working closely with trade unions in particular, recognising them as part of the solution to a lot of this, with their health and safety reps and that expertise. We need to use this time actually to deal with some of those issues of particularly poor working practice that now we see are not just bad, obviously, for those workers, but very, very bad for public health. And that discussion, unfortunately, in some cases seems to have become twisted into one around, even around immigration enforcement. Actually, we've seen that in some cases, when really this should be about what's happening in workplaces and why we have such a lack of control for different workers. We then also need to make sure, we would argue, that government uses its powers, uses the public spending also that it's putting in right now to deliver positive work outcomes for people. So obviously this morning I set out in my speech areas where we want government to change course around job recovery, around retraining, around rebuilding businesses. Now, we would say in each one of those cases, there shouldn't be a blank check from government. Actually, government should be working with those different businesses to make sure that they're treating their workers decently, that they're preserving employment into the future. And that should actually be a condition of continuing support, so that we're using the power of the public purse to support those decent employment outcomes. And this is not something that huge numbers of businesses are against. Actually, when I talk to business audiences, there are quite a number of them who say that they want this time to be used to focus on what's often called more purposeful business, more responsible business. So let's make sure that government is backing that as well. I think incidentally, we need to make sure that the power of procurement is used in that relation as well. Quite worrying suggestions that we could see a continuation of very major contracts being provided to businesses which have not shown themselves as having positive employment practice, Amazon being a worrying case from that point of view. And finally, let's make sure when we have the stimulus, and in my view, we need to have a stimulus, particularly on green investment, which matches the ambitions of other countries. The UK certainly doesn't at the moment. When we deliver that stimulus, let's again make sure that it's tied into positive employment outcomes, ones where we will see sustainable employment in different parts of the country, working with those different stakeholders and local communities that can deliver that. I mean, we know, for example, that the Future Jobs Fund in 2008-9, when that was effective, it was because it was working with trade unions, business associations, local authorities. That's how it made sure that employers didn't use it in the overwhelming majority of cases in an exploitative way, just to substitute younger workers, for older workers. Instead, it was used to genuinely build opportunities. That's what we need again now from government. And quite frankly, if we can't use this time to push for more decent work, when will we ever do it? And so that's why I would just say finally, obviously, Angela Rayner called yesterday for us to have that national conversation and push for decent pay for our care workers. We need to make sure we have much more of a discussion nationally about pay for all of our key workers. If the time isn't now, then when will it be? Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Annalisa, and thank you. You've got a packed schedule today, so we appreciate you being with us. You mentioned just now the importance of not writing blank cheques, and in your Labour conference speech, you mentioned the importance of government not being cavalier with public money. Now, some of the headlines overnight seem to give the impression that you were saying the government shouldn't be spending so much right now. I'm pretty well, having read your speech and listened to it, it's clear you're not making that point. But I wonder if, to some extent, it was deliberate in the sense that you want to give the impression, or you want to convey the message that Labour will be a safe custodian of public funds, that you actually want people to trust the Labour Party with public money again. Is that one of your objectives?
Well, to be completely honest, Ben, what my objective is right now is to try and make sure that our country gets to a better place, genuinely. You know, this is something that goes way beyond party politics. We have the worst excess death rate in Europe, as people will know, but we're also facing the deepest recession in the G7, incredibly intense levels of unemployment, and what looks like one of the slowest recoveries actually in Europe as well. So we've got to get this right, and that's why I think government needs to be focused on targeting spending where it's needed, because when we've put forward solutions to the problems that we face, as has the TUC and the CBI and many others, saying, for example, we need to have targeted wage support. So often Conservatives have thrown back at us, well, you just want to spend more money, just more and more. It's not about that. It's about where it's targeted, making sure we get the benefit from it to keep people in work in particular, to make sure the jobs of the future are created, and to make sure that we face up to that enormous challenge of the climate crisis as well.
Yeah. We've had a question from Alice, who's a Labour member in Durham, Annalise, and she was she's suggesting that the Conservatives are talking about tax rises, and it looks like, she says, they're going to have to raise taxes at some point. She said she'd be interested to hear what taxes you'd like to see. Is that something at all that you're thinking about at the moment, tax rises?
Well, obviously, the Labour Party is always reviewing policy, and we're working towards that general election in 2024, when we will have clearly very encompassing tax plans. I've made no secret of the fact that I think our tax system must become more progressive. That's absolutely imperative. But I've also made no secret of the fact that I don't believe that the Conservative government should right now be focused on saying it will impose tax rises in the short run, just so it can pull those tax rises away in advance of a general election and have a bonanza. That is precisely the wrong thing it should be doing now. It's already impacting on demand. And as I said, we've got a really weak recovery now, particularly compared to other countries. It's not the discussion that government should be engaged in now. It should be focused on retaining jobs. Okay,
that's very clear. Right, we're going to move on to Frances O'Grady, of the TUC, and she's going to talk about how we can ensure we act quickly to provide the training needed so that those of us worst affected can transfer into new roles. Over to you, Frances.
Thanks very much. First of all, just to say thanks to JRF, who do brilliant work, and to Annalise, if you haven't already, check out, there's a wonderful picture of you in the Mirror online today that you should see. In fact, what I want to talk about is, first of all, to make a direct appeal to government, given the news that we've heard today from the Chief Scientific Advisor and Public Health. For goodness sake, get a grip, sort out, test and trace, make sure that safety standards at work are enforced. Otherwise, we're facing real trouble. So that's a kind of urgent message, I think, today. But from the TUC's perspective, our top priority is simple. It's save good jobs now. The JRS, which we argued hard for, as we know, supported 1 in 3 jobs in the economy at its peak. It's helped lots of firms to get back on their feet. But if we pull the rug at the end of October, then we will see mass unemployment, and stopping that ought to be a priority for everybody. I would just like to challenge this notion that they're all zombie jobs and restructuring is a great thing. Not for the people at the end of it. These aren't zombie jobs. We know that many companies are in trouble through no fault of their own, simply because we have a global pandemic. So it is important that we move to the next phase, and we've argued for a job protection and upskilling scheme so that employers would need to bring workers back on short-time working. So at least, you know, we've suggested start with at least 10% of normal hours. That for downtime, there would be retraining and upskilling. That's an investment for the future, and recognizing that nobody quite knows when this pandemic is scheduled to end, but it's certainly not at the end of October. And that the government would continue to provide wage subsidy as long as employers continue to pay at least 80% of normal pay. And just like Annalise, we think strings should be attached. I don't think the public would stomach the idea of, you know, taxpayers' money going into companies only to find its way to the boardroom or shareholders. I think people appreciate that strong link with wages. They want to see fair rewards in companies, and frankly, they want to know that companies are paying their fair share of tax here in the UK in order to qualify. On top of that, we think there will need to be targeted help. It's clear that the business models operating in some industries are really going to struggle as we try and live and work with the virus. So we are going to need changes. Again, we've argued bring together national and sectoral recovery councils. Let's bring business, unions, government together around the table. I can tell you, unions and employers are talking all the time. There is something a bit surreal about the idea that the government will only talk to us if we're kept in separate rooms. It's daft. This is a national crisis, and we need to start setting aside those sort of tribal dogmas and actually trying to sort it out. Thirdly, we think there needs to be job creation, and we've set out quite detailed plans on green transport and infrastructure, an £85 billion plan over 2 years to create over 1 million jobs, not least in the parts of the country that need them most. And we've also argued for public services. You know, again, through crises in the past, if you like, maybe before Thatcherism, it was understood that public services have a role in picking up some of the slack to keep money flowing through the economy. Actually, in terms of where we are now, after 10 years of austerity cuts, we've got real pressures in social care, in the NHS, in local government. We should be building employment in public services because that's key to our resilience for the future. And Kickstart, Annalise has touched on, again, we strongly supported the Future Jobs Fund. We argued the government should put in place something similar, targeting young people. I'm worried about the quality of Kickstart, I'll be honest. You know, there are tests for me about making sure there isn't job displacement, so you don't just hire young people and sack older, more expensive ones, that there is proper off-the-job training and decent pay, and that there is a voice, from my perspective, the only independent voice, a union voice, built into that scheme. And finally, I'd end up with this, Ben. I think this virus has exposed the deep, deep inequality and economic injustice that we have in this country on lines of class, race, and gender too. And I think many of us have really had to look hard at ourselves as a society, look hard in the mirror and question why it is that so many people doing the most important work in society get paid the least, but also treated so badly. There is no worse metaphor for this virus for me than social care workers on agency contracts being paid the minimum wage, moving from home to home, spreading the virus to old people because of the way that they're employed. And I think we have to wake up to the fact that these poor employment practices are a public health hazard. So we shouldn't just deliver a new deal for working people because that's fair for those workers. We should do it because we want to become a stronger, more equal society and economy too.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Frances. That was really powerful and comprehensive. The TUC has very helpfully set out what you would do to extend or replace the furlough, however you want to describe it. There were also hints from the Chancellor last week that they are looking at something or potentially cooking something up. I wonder just your view of the politics of it. It seems to me that if we are going into a new phase of local lockdowns, maybe even more national restrictions, that it would be very difficult, perhaps even impossible, for the Chancellor to not offer some support to businesses and workers who are seeing their economic livelihoods threatened by those measures. Do you think something, as many people do, is likely to come and to be unveiled probably in the coming weeks?
I think there's going to be something. I went into the Treasury to meet the Chancellor not so long ago, I'm trying to remember now, just before Congress. And, it's good that he's listening. I think he needs to understand that link between support for business and it ending up in wage packets, that's the condition, is really, really important to keep. And I was also making the case, these are any government in power. There would be big judgment calls, difficult dilemmas, but we're not the only country going through this. And if you look at what's happening in Germany, in France, in Austria, it's under active consideration in Ireland, Denmark. Every country is having to look at continuing wage subsidy schemes as the best way to help the economy bounce back once we're through this crisis. And I would argue that if the Chancellor doesn't do that, it will set Britain at a competitive disadvantage, not least when we have not yet got a trade deal with the EU in the bag.
Now we've got a question from Jennifer Sands, and she's asking about a policy that comes up a lot. I'm sure you'll have heard it many times: universal basic income. She asks, is full employment still the right goal, and should universal basic income be a central plank so unpaid work such as caring is enabled? I wonder if Annalisa Dodds is still there. I hope she is. I wonder if she could give us the current Labour Party view on this question of universal basic income, which has a lot of popularity amongst some people.
Thanks, Ben. And yes, I have been here. Apologies. I was trying to very quickly eat something while I was listening to Frances's really very helpful remarks. Obviously, this crisis is making so many people, unfortunately, come face to face with the reality of social security in this country. The fact that our safety net is an incredibly threadbare one. We've calculated that even with the changes that have gone into universal credit, it only replaces about a third to, in some cases, a half of people's incomes, but very, very little. I suppose the issue for me with universal basic income is that it comes with a huge amount of baggage and it means so many different things to so many different people. If we're talking about a situation where, for example, older workers, those who are kind of mid-50s plus, whether they should be subjected to the kind of, often really quite humiliating experiences with job centres and having to apply for different forms of work they're very unlikely to get. If we're seeing that UBI is about removing some of that conditionality, then that's one thing. If we're seeing UBI is instead a system of having a payment to every single person, which then means you don't have any other form of social security, it's a very, very different thing, and something that I really wouldn't support, because actually people do have different needs which cost different amounts to face up to. And I suppose, I guess you'd expect me to say this as the Shadow Chancellor. There's then also, of course, that question of, if we're not saying that universal basic income would swallow up all other forms of social security, if we're saying we will recognise people's additional needs, then we do need to work out how we would pay for that system. Now, interesting ideas out there, but I would say there are other big challenges facing our country right now as well. Big challenges around housing, big challenges around, obviously, the climate crisis, big challenges around inequality more generally, not all of which would be dealt with through a UBI. So yes, interesting discussion, but to be honest with you, right now in this crisis, what I want to do is get universal credit reformed quickly, speedily, so much that can be done right now to be getting money into the pockets of the poorest people who really need it, and with the legacy benefits as well.
Yes. We've got a question from Matt Byrne. Maybe I can put this one to you, Francis. It's asking really how important the benefit system is for sort of lubricating the jobs market at a time like this. He says, how important are benefit levels, as Annalise was saying, maintaining the universal credit uplift and extending it to legacy benefits to ensure people have the headspace to meaningfully engage with employment support? Is that key for you?
Yeah, I think, very sadly, there are tens of thousands of workers who we represent who are now finding out for the first time just how inadequate our benefit system is. Certainly if you're trying to live on it for a sustained period. And I think at its heart, this is a question, whether it's universal basic income or our benefit system, it's about a recognition that the balance of power has gone too far in one direction against ordinary working people, ordinary working families, and that we need to do something to put that balance right and give people decency and dignity. And, it's one of the reasons I'm so concerned about the casual attitude in some quarters to mass unemployment. Frankly, mass unemployment is a license to the bad employer to undercut the good and to exploit people, because people become desperate in competition for work. But it will also mean a very big rise in child poverty if we don't sort this out. And again, I think people forget too easily just how bad it was in the 1980s, never mind if we reach levels like the 1930s. So yes, I do think sorting out in its broadest sense our social security system, how do we provide security for people and ensure that all the risk of the ups and downs of our economic cycles aren't put on the shoulders of ordinary working families.
Annalise, I want to ask you about something that Francis mentioned about these aren't zombies jobs. So this critique that sort of keeping people on furlough keeps them in zombie jobs, and that's not fair to them or the economy or the taxpayer at large. I wonder how important you think it is, though, to enable people to move to more productive jobs as well. How do you think about, and how does Labour think about that mechanism? If you extend the furlough, you extend support, how do you then help people move into more productive and fulfilling jobs as well? Is it still, can the two be reconciled?
Well, they absolutely can, but I think there's been a peculiar discussion around this sometimes coming from the government side in particular, where they've almost suggested that people want to be on the furlough scheme, that they want to be able to be in the workplace. That's not what people want. People want to be working. They want to be actually, engaged with their workmates. This isn't a situation that they chose for themselves. And I think it's very, very patronising, actually, some of the language that's been used around this. The problem currently is that we do not have a high level of vacancies coming back through into the UK economy. We had an absolute cliff downwards in the rate of vacancies coming through. Yes, we're seeing some pickup now. That's very, very positive. Actually, in many cases, worryingly, the kinds of jobs that are being provided are ones that are very, very precarious and low paid. So we're not talking about a kind of like for like substitution of jobs feeding through into the economy. And in those circumstances, government needs to both do more to support businesses to create new jobs, but it does also need to make sure that where people can retain a relationship with an employer, where they can be coming back into the workplace for short hours working, have that backed by government so that they retain that connection, then it should be supported by government. So, this is not an either or. If we were in a situation where we had very, very high rates of high quality jobs being created in the UK economy, then perhaps this might be a slightly different discussion. But actually, lots of the jobs that we are losing right now, they're jobs which have a viable future, jobs which support whole communities, which have long supply chains, which once they're gone from our country, they're not going to come back quickly. So let's have a more accurate view of the labour market than what seems to be motivating, I would say, a lot of government policy at the moment.
Yes, that's a very, very interesting point. We've got a question from Jonathan Hibbert, which would be very interested to get Francis and Annalise's views on. He says, is there a need to overhaul the redundancy process as there may be more flexible options? Now, the way I think you guys have both framed it is that you need to have a lot of carrot. You need to incentivize companies to hold on to workers. But does there need to be some kind of regulatory stick as well? Do we need to make it harder at this moment for companies to fire people? Let me put that to you first, Francis.
So during TUC Congress, we were highlighting the fact that that week was the start of the 45-day notice period that employers had to give for redundancies. And I think you'll be hearing more from us on this, but what is important about the rights that we have now is that where unions are recognised, we get the chance to put forward alternatives. And very often employers will listen because, in industries like aviation, we've got a track record of showing, look, if we're in trouble, are there ways that we can share work rather than, and make one section of the workforce pay the entire price. We've also come up with really good ideas for getting through difficult times in arts and culture, in advanced manufacturing, and so on. So anything that strengthened that kind of serious ability to for unions to put that proposition to employers, as we often do in a business plan way, costed, seriously thought through, and for employers to have to seriously work with us and respond to that, the better. But I think, we have seen too many of those sort of knee-jerk reactions in some cases where it's almost like employers cutting their losses, too much trouble, just get shot at people and move on. So anything that strengthens workers' rights to prevent redundancies happening in the first place, I think, is to be welcomed.
And Annalise, a lot of people say that one of the strengths of the UK labour market has been its flexibility. Do you agree with Francis that it's perhaps too flexible at the moment and we are going to reap some of the adverse consequences of that?
Well, I think we are seeing some really pretty appalling developments where, as I mentioned earlier, we've got, in fact, not just one, but a number of companies which have said that they're going to make redundant all of their employees and then rehire a proportion of them on worse terms and conditions, and completely avoiding the kind of engagement that Francis just talked about. In fact, in some cases, they're even paying out the redundancy period using the funds from the furlough scheme, which is not what they were intended for at all. We would say that there should have been harder conditions applied by government when it was clear that this was starting to happen. So we do think that there needs to be much more of a recognition of, as Francis mentioned, the positive role of trade unions in the workplace, making sure that we have that joint kind of model to deal with many of these issues. And, I would say, from my point of view as Shadow Chancellor, actually that's something that is very, very good for productivity generally. When you have that engagement from the workforce with employers, you tend to have businesses that are more effective, more resilient, more sustainable for the future. So it is what we should be focused on for the future.
A very pertinent question about public policy at the moment is raising the national minimum wage, or the national living wage, whichever one you want to call it. I mean, there have been some credible institutions, I think the IFS and the Resolution Foundation among them, who said that perhaps it's not the best time to do that. So, Annalise, first of all, what's Labour's view on this? Should the government continue raising that because it's the right thing to do, or should they be concerned about the potential impacts on the jobs market at this very difficult time?
Well, we are concerned about the impact on the jobs market. We've said that the Low Pay Commission needs to make sure in these determinations that it's actually talking to trade unions and to the low paid themselves. We think that's absolutely critical. Clearly, we are in a difficult set of circumstances here, but actually, is the answer to that set of circumstances preventing people from being able to improve their living standards? I mean, we've seen the impact of that long squeeze for the last 10 years on living standards, with a quarter of UK families lacking £100 in savings when they entered this crisis. So really, as I say, the Low Pay Commission needs to engage on this issue and to do so with those who'd be directly affected.
Well, I should have said that question came from Pat Haig about the national living wage. We're going to go to Helen Barnard very shortly, but I wonder if I could just first get your view on that, Francis. What's the view on it?
It would be a complete betrayal by this government of blue-collar Britain if that minimum wage doesn't rise in line with what was planned. Think about who's on the minimum wage: cleaners, supermarket workers, these are social care workers. These are workers who are definitely needed. Their jobs are not on the line because they're needed. They are key workers. In fact, 2 million key workers in this country rely directly on the national minimum wage. Frankly, how dare they, from a moral point of view, even consider not giving them the pay rise that they're due? I think what I can promise you is that we have lots of clips from YouTube of government ministers clapping key workers on those Thursday nights. And I'm sure they won't want to see all over YouTube the double standards that most of us would see in place if they don't put their money where their mouths are.
Excellent. Right, we're going to move on. As promised, Helen Barnard, who's been waiting extremely patiently. Thank you so much, Helen. And I think you're going to talk about your own JRF research on how do we build a new generation of good jobs. Over to you. If you can unmute, Helen.
Sorry, I thought I'd unmuted. Hello, everyone. Nice to be here. So I think what we've seen in recent months is the way that COVID has impacted especially heavily on people who were already struggling to get by. So people who were already in poverty have been much more likely to lose their jobs, to have income drops, and to be facing extra costs. And that has fed through into much higher levels of hardship. But also places that already had weaker economies are also seeing the impact of this storm much more heavily. Now, I think we should give credit to the government working with business and trade unions that initial response was very bold, was very compassionate. So the job retention scheme, the boost to universal credit and so on happened fast, and they were absolutely right. We would also, by the way, like to see the furlough scheme extended in a targeted way for those sectors who can't come back. But that doesn't look that likely. And even if it did, I think we're all expecting to see waves of unemployment now going across the country. And again, when we've looked at who is going to be affected by that, it is massively disproportionately the lowest paid workers who are most at risk, the places which already have fewer jobs and fewer good jobs, likely to see large numbers going. And it's actually the groups who find it hardest to get on in the labour market. So disabled workers, women, especially mothers, people from some BAME groups who are likely to be hardest hit by this. So and there is a potential for a vicious cycle to happen where in places with weak economies, people's incomes drop even further. That feeds into less spending power in those places, and they fall even further behind than they were before. So because of all that, we think that we need to have an incredibly strong national focus on how do we navigate these waves of unemployment. And in particular, how do we learn from previous recessions and recoveries to get a stronger one? And the two biggest lessons from the last recession and recovery that we've taken Well, first of all, the focus was almost entirely on the quantity of jobs and not the quality of jobs. And that gave us a decade of stagnant pay, of surging in-work poverty, of poor national productivity, and made us much more vulnerable to this shock than we would have been. The second big lesson is that cutting social security at a point where people are facing unemployment and a weak economy obviously makes life vastly harder for those individuals, but actually what it also does is take confidence and spending out of the economy, exactly where you actually want to keep that going. So one of the biggest decisions this autumn is, will the government keep that boost to universal credit, which is, if that goes, you've got 16 million people seeing their incomes drop overnight in April by about £1,000 a year. I mean, a very serious amount. And that will pull hundreds of thousands into poverty and into deep poverty. So that's one thing. We've just got to keep that lifeline, which has been so vital for people there. But the second set of things are about building a stronger recovery. And there's a few things we think need to happen to deliver that. The first is using investment. We know public sector investment is going to be going into the economy, using that to create good quality jobs. So in things like our social infrastructure, we all know, I think now, the adult social care model doesn't work, the funding doesn't work. We need to get that sorted out, but we can also use that to create better quality jobs. Similarly, we know there's investment coming in energy efficiency. Having good quality green new jobs would also be a way of bringing hundreds of thousands of opportunities, but also actually encouraging private sector employers to hire. So lowering the costs of hiring a new worker, putting extra incentives to hire workers who've been out of work for a long time, trying to do everything we can to boost that job growth, but to make it good quality jobs. And that part of the way we do that is by the second thing, which is delivering a right to retrain. So one of the things we've seen is hundreds of thousands of workers stuck in poor quality jobs where they don't get a lot of training, they don't get a lot of prospects or chances to progress. But what you've often seen in the past is good quality jobs are created, but the people who need them, who are out of work or in low paid jobs, don't get them because there isn't a targeted package of training which gives those people the skills to get into those jobs in the places where we need them. So actually taking the various different funding pots for adult education, putting them into one single stream, devolving them down to mayors, to the devolved governments, to local authorities, and demanding that they use that to connect local people who need better quality work to the better jobs which should be being created locally, will make the best use of public money and also set us on a much stronger recovery path. And then the final thing is to think about those places. So we came into COVID with places that were lagging far behind. So even if people did have skills, there weren't a lot of good jobs for them. We've then seen COVID hitting those places harder. So actually we've been knowing that the UK Shared Prosperity Fund is coming down the road to replace European money. Given the situation we're in, we actually think you should double that investment through that new fund. And again, focusing it in on those places that have the lowest employment and also have the lowest paid work will get the best value for that money and help to drive this recovery, which should mean when another shock comes down the road, we will be much more resilient, both as families and communities and nationally. But the key thing also is we've got to keep the social security lifeline in place while all that happens, or we will see people being pulled into deeper poverty with all the damage to your health that brings. And we need our people to be fit to take those new opportunities as we're creating them. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Helen. And I was very pleased to see in your report that you actually have a comprehensive definition of what a good job actually is, because a lot of the time we don't actually talk about that, but it is extremely important because a good job can be in the eye of the beholder. And I think what you've emphasised, that it's fair pay, sufficient hours, availability of training, security and dignity at work, and that strikes me as a very comprehensive and fair definition of a good job, and one that we should be more prominent in the debate. So thank you so much for that. I think we'll go straight on to Darren Jones, who's now joined us, which is excellent, and he's going to talk about an extremely important topic, which is which sectors people and places are being hardest hit by job losses and why? So over to you, Darren.
Well, Ben, thank you. And thank you to JRF and colleagues for the invitation to be here today. I'm delighted to be sharing a panel with all of you, with Annalise, Francis and Helen. I'm sorry that I couldn't be here at the start to listen. I was on a CIRA panel, so forgive me for being a little late. I'm going to speak primarily in the context of the work that I'm doing on my select committee. I chair the Business Energy Industrial Strategy Committee in the House of Commons, and we're kicking off our inquiry this Thursday on what we think the industrial strategy ought to look like in the future. And then next week, we're doing another kind of limb of work related to economic growth around levelling up and devolution. And I'm going to kind of speak about both of those in the context of the question you've asked today, because there's on the sector question, there are two different buckets as far as I can see. There are the sectors that are going to take longer to reopen as a consequence of the public health crisis that we're in. And then there are the sectors that are strategically important in terms of fueling the quickest possible recovery when we can get back to business and generating sustainable growth to create new jobs in every region and nation of the country. Now, that can be a really difficult conversation, because in deciding on that second bucket, you've got to say, well, which sectors are strategically important for growth and which aren't? And I don't know the answer to that. And I'm going to be asking our witnesses on Thursday, and I hope that they'll have some data and insight, because as politicians, we don't want to say, I'm sorry, but this sector isn't strategically important, but this sector is. My hunch, though, is that, of course, they're related, because unless you've got strategic sectors driving economic growth, creating jobs, you're not going to have people with disposable income and time and money to be able to use other sectors of the economy. So I'm not suggesting you take a black and white approach, but you've got to understand how these things connect, so that when you are devising your industrial strategy, you know where you get the most bang for your buck in creating that kind of knock-on consequence for other parts of the economy. In terms of people and places that are being hit the most, I mean, we know very clearly from the data that women are being hit disproportionately compared to men, often because they tend to be in sectors which are being hit more from the pandemic and on lower pay and reduced terms and conditions. And so we absolutely need to think about that, not just in the context of their jobs, but also because the data shows that women not only are being hit the most by jobs, but also continue to take the burden in terms of childcare responsibilities. And so the economic discussion has to be related to childcare as an infrastructure priority, as well as kind of jobs in the workplace. And on places, the thing that I worry about, and I was on a visit recently to Vauxhall in Ellesmere Port and Airbus in North Wales, and I represent part of Bristol where we've got a lot of aerospace. You see, certainly in the manufacturing sector, really important factories and workplaces that are the main local employer, and not just in their own boundaries, but with the very significant supply chain of SMEs. And the SMEs are much less resilient than the big players, and the big players are under stress as it is. So you've got to take this kind of SME plus big player view in terms of your geographical distribution of industrial strategy, because if they go, you will have some very tricky workers to place who have got advanced skills, who have maybe worked in the sector all their life, but have got nowhere then to go in their locality to be able to use that. And that's why I think the question around state-sponsored and state-supported training and skills development, bringing forward R&D spending and innovation spending, is really, really important, because it's much easier to train people in the workplace than it is when they're at home on universal credit. There's, I think, much more of an economic advantage from doing that. And we've seen today Airbus, for example, have announced they've got some prototypes around hydrogen-fueled aircraft. Fantastic. We really need to get on with that. We need people in the workplace that can work on that. My slight criticism of the government, we've been doing some work on the committee around the impacts of COVID on business and workers, is that, and I don't know whether Francis would agree or disagree on this, but it looks like they've not really been engaging either with businesses or unions. And they started to engage with unions and then didn't really. And there were these kind of roundtables on growth where the government got a load of businesses on a Zoom call that only happened once, and there were no real follow-ups or actions. And some businesses were invited and some weren't, and no one really knew how businesses were selected to come, and trade unions weren't invited to those conversations. And that's not just happening at a Westminster level. In my neck of the woods, with our regional mayor at the West of England Combined Authority, his industrial strategy group didn't have any trade unions in it. And I was like, why are the trade unions in this conversation? And it was kind of a second thought. So on the committee that I chair, we've invested in some additional capacity. We always invite trade union voices to our discussions. And we're going to be engaging with business in a way that I don't think the government has been willing to. So what do I think we kind of need to do about it? There are a couple of things that I'm interested to pursue and to take evidence and counsel on through the committee. The first is, how do you get this policy distinction right between sectors that will take longer to open, where you have to support people in work because of the public good in doing so, versus how do you identify the strategic sectors that will fuel our economic recovery as quickly as possible. In doing so, how do you learn the lesson from previous sector deals under the last industrial strategy, which still technically exists but isn't really being followed at the moment, that has conditionality on it related to sustainable growth, net zero transition, job creation, apprenticeships, and geographical location. And the last thing I would like to see is more state leadership, as I say, around redundancy and training support. I've had examples of employers in my constituency, often SMEs, who actually, because of the sector they're in, you know, lots of people are doing it at their homes, for example, at the moment, apparently in Bristol. He needed to employ some people to help him fit new fireplaces. Couldn't find anybody, tried to advertise, didn't really, weirdly, get any applications for the job. So there's a disconnect between employers and businesses who are able to recruit and take people on, and those that are losing their jobs. And I'm told it's regional mayors that have the responsibility to deliver that, but I've actually not seen anything effectively put together. And there's lots of parts of the country that have no regional mayors. And so I think the government absolutely has to think about supporting sectors and workers, but also helping them transition and change in what is evidently going to be a difficult economic period. And the last thing I would say before I wrap up, because I've got no idea how long I've been whittling on for, is Brexit. The government are in a complete mess on Brexit, and this will hit some of these sectors and places that are already being hit the most by COVID even more if there is not a deal at the end of the year. Vauxhall, as I mentioned, in Ellesmere Port, export, I think it's 90% of the vehicles they make to Europe. And if there's no deal at the end of the year, they need to know how a kind of country of origin check's going to work, how are the tariffs going to work. And that's why sector deals aren't just about money and conditionality, they are regulatory and policy decisions in the interest of stimulating jobs and growth. And we've not seen any of that from the government, and they've got to get a move on.
Excellent. Well, Darren, that's great. There's much food for thought there. We've had a couple of questions which follow on very nicely from some of the big themes you've been talking about. One is from Corrine Bacon, who asks, is there too much reliance on services trading within the UK and in exports? May this have led to some of our current problems? Of course, services around 80% of GDP. Manufacturing has been falling as a share for much of the past 3 decades. We've also got a question from Anne Richardson, and she says, Francis touched on inequality. What do the panel think about increasing the diversity of business ownership, giving workers a stake and a say? I want to throw that one first, if I may, to Annalise Dodds, because Labour went into the last election promising to give workers much more of a say, trying to give them 10% equity ownership of companies. Does that policy still stand? How is Labour at the moment thinking about this important issue of workers' control?
Well, of course, every element of Labour's programme for the next general election is going to be worked through that process that we always follow when we bring our members together and different stakeholders. But certainly I can say that I personally am very committed to making sure that we have much more of a worker voice generally at the levels of power, for want of a better way of putting it. I'm a cooperative MP as well as a Labour MP, and you know, again, we were just talking about this before, we know the benefits from that. We know the impact that it has on productivity, on the sustainability of business. It's been critically important through this period, where those businesses that have had a trusting, open relationship with their workers, when they have had workers who have been in those senior positions, they've been able to make sure that they adapted quickly to the crisis, brought people with them, and ensured that there were safe workplaces. So I do think that it's very, very important.
And let me bring in Helen. I mean, Helen, do you think that that is something that should be retained as Labour Party policy? Were you pleased to see them offering the ability for workers to have a stake in the companies for which they work?
I think it may be part of the solution, but I think there is sometimes a danger of assuming if you can just get workers on the board, everything else magically follows. And I think actually there are other bits you need to have in place. So one bit is about the regulatory environment, and particularly around security. So increasing the level of security and predictability of hours and things that workers have. The other, though, is actually about productivity, and it speaks, I think, to previous speaker as well, that quite a lot of our big sectors, our big low-paid sectors, service sectors, are much less productive than the same sectors in other European countries. So we've had a look at why that is, and there are a couple of things. that have come out. One is about management. So we are not very good at management in the UK. And that's actually not something I think that you fix through boards or regulation. I think you need to fix that through using business support to get businesses to manage people better, make better use of skills. But the other is security. So there's lots of evidence piling up that more secure workers are more productive.
Yeah.
So I think workers on boards could help, but equally I think you could do most of this without doing that. So I don't think we need to wait for that big change. We can actually get it going this autumn.
And let me bring in Francis O'Grady. It'd be very good to hear your thoughts on that, but also this big question of, do we have an economy which is too dominated by services? Of course, this goes to some of the issues that we've been talking about already about low productivity jobs. I mean, there is a view that, you know, lots of people working in sandwich shops, they're not as productive as people working in manufacturing. Now, what's your view on that big question about where, you know, the balance of our economy in terms of services and manufacturing?
So what's clear is that that dependence on services has left us uniquely vulnerable for lots of health and business reasons. But I mean, I think there's also a really practical policy issue here, which is that a lot of businesses are really reluctant to take on more loans. Sorry, my phone's going. Hope you can't hear that. It'll stop in a minute. But a lot of businesses are really reluctant to take on more loans. So despite the Chancellor's announcement, I'm not sure how much that's going to help. And that's one of the reasons why I think government, especially at a time when servicing government can borrow money at a very low rate, this is the time to be thinking about taking equity stakes in those companies that are important for our future strategically. So that's something I think we should be looking at, as again, many other countries have done. And in fact, you know, the US, not always seen as a radically socialist country, took that approach under Obama in response to the last recession, and it proved to be very successful. And just on corporate governance, I think we do need a new framework. I think we need a framework for the 21st century, or even just to catch up with the 20th century in terms of workers having a voice. But what's also really critical is collective bargaining. We know that's one of the, if you like, the easiest ways to redress that imbalance of power, to create better, more satisfying, more skilled, greener, family-friendly jobs. You know, so it seems to me this would be a really quick way, promoting collective bargaining, supporting that, making sure that our framework of law on trade unions is fair. That would be a really easy thing for any government to do right now.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Francis. And unfortunately, Annalise has had to go to another panel, but thanks so much to her for joining us. Darren, let me put a question to you that we've had from Stephen. He says, one barrier to public support for government intervention is the "how will you pay for it" argument. Yesterday, Andrew Marr repeatedly challenged Keir Starmer on that. Is it not time that Labour started reviving the Keynesian argument on government spending in a recession? This is an interesting one, isn't it? Because in a way, you might argue that the government itself is quite keen on Keynesian counter-cyclical spending at the moment. Is this? Do you need to make the case as well? What's your thoughts?
So sometimes Labour politicians get a bit nervous when we're asked that question, because then the right-wing media kind of blow it out of all proportion. But I'm pretty relaxed, because actually the answer to how are you going to pay for it is, well, we're going to have to borrow some money. Everyone agrees about that. We're going to have to borrow more money than we've borrowed for a very long time as a country. And by the way, so is everybody else. And so we should be, open and honest about that. We can't just let Rishi Sunak across the road here from me say we're going to borrow all this money, and then Labour says, "Oh, I don't know how we're going to pay for it." We're going to borrow some money, and we need to, because it's a public good on behalf of the public. And I just think we should be a bit kind of confident about saying that.
We've got a question here from Omar Salem, and he asks, much of Labour's political campaigning in the last few decades has focused on public services, but should there have been more focus on jobs and wages. Let me put this one to Helen, I think. From your perspective at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, do you regret? Do you think was there an overemphasis on the wrong thing from your point of view?
I think there's certainly not been enough focus on not just the kind of jobs as a whole thing, but the kind of jobs people are in. And I think there has also been a kind of not enough of making the argument that actually most of the things we're all talking about from the point of view of workers are also good for businesses and business productivity. I think that argument hasn't been made strongly enough, and I think it needs to be. And actually you can do that from the right or the left or the centre. There's a different perspective, but actually it works for all of those. I also think there's too great an emphasis just on the minimum wage, because one of the biggest things around in-work poverty, it's not just your entry-level wage, it's whether 10, 15 years later you're still on that low wage. I think we should have seen massively more focus on progression and how you help people progress. Whereas I think otherwise people just focus in on that bottom wage. Most people in in-work poverty don't actually ever get off that. They're trying to raise a family on it. And that's something we have to crack.
Mm. And Frances, it'd be good to get your thoughts on that. Is that a false choice, public services versus jobs and wages?
I think as a broad labour movement, we could do more to make the very simple argument that investment in public services is critical for the private sector, because any private sector company needs a workforce that's healthy and able to get back to work when they're fit. We need transport, because that's about getting people to and from work safely, and we need a skilled and educated workforce. So I think we could have made that case more strongly, but I also in my gut kind of feel, we need to be talking about the private sector more. That's where the majority of people by far earn a livelihood. And it's important that we're seen to understand what life is like and what the priorities are, and what people's solutions to the problems that we all face are. So I do think it's important to be seen to be in touch. Yes.
I want to talk about this issue of learning lessons from past recessions. Now, I'm pretty sure we're all far too young to remember the 1980s recession. But let's think about that one, because that really was, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the big scarring recession economically and socially and in terms of geography in so many ways. Let me ask you, Darren, when you think about that case study, what would you say are the most important lessons and the things to avoid?
Well, I think the most important lesson is there's a role for the state in all of this. You can't just leave it to markets. And again, this goes back to industrial strategy and is linked to your previous question. I do think we've not spent enough time in the past understanding what the constraints on growth are in the private sector in terms of generating value, profits and jobs, and how you share the value of those profits more fairly. And let me give you an example. When I was preparing for second reading of the trade bill a couple of months ago now, I checked what it is that we actually make in the UK and what new things we had made in the last 10 years. And we're pretty good at kind of aerospace, automotive, gas turbines and pharmaceuticals. Those are our big kind of manufacturing sectors. And in the previous 10 years, the only two new things that we added to our export basket, so things that we make and export, the only two new things were leather goods and sheep, bovine and goat fats. Now, I'm vegan, so I have a bit of a personal aversion to those, but putting that to one side, that's a very small market and added about $1 of GDP per capita. And you compare us to France in the same time period, who have invested in and expanded their manufacturing production. They added about $150 of GDP per capita. And so this isn't a Brexit argument, because of course France has been much better than we have, and they've been in the European Union. And so we've not focused on that enough. And I do think that when it comes to the issue of public sector, which you've talked about, but also private sector modernisation, especially linked to this issue about recapitalisation if there are debt issues, government needs to be looking at how you can bring forward capital investment, in my view, around the adoption of technology and digital solutions to improve productivity, and apply conditionality to that so that workers also benefit from any increase in profit margins as a consequence of it. And I think it's not, it's perfectly doable for us to bring these things together and to provide that framework and direction from Whitehall and devolve it to regional and local leaders, businesses and trade unions. And that's what we're trying to get to in my inquiry on the committee.
Francis, one of the economic successes that people cite from the 1980s, not from the recession, but sort of 1986 onwards, is financial services, deregulation, the Big Bang. Darren mentioned Brexit earlier, and that's obviously a threat to the City of London, or at least many people think it is. How do you think about, at the TUC, financial services and the City of London? Is that something that's an important part of our economic and industrial mix? Is it something that extracts rent from the rest of the economy? How do you broadly think about it, the sector?
So we obviously represent tens of thousands of people who work in the banking and finance sector, but I think we would sign up to that view that the dominance of that sector has been problematic for the whole economy. And as you say, that was kind of when it was let rip in the 1980s. And I just to comment on the 80s, because I think one of the key lessons there, whichever school you're from, so I think the story about the 80s very much depends on whether you fell into the group of the haves or the have-nots. And, you know, it was a very polarized experience between those who, you know, bought their new home, had a great time, good wages, steady job, and those who experienced unemployment. And those, but whichever school you're in, even if you're in the school of the haves and thought that that kind of what I would see as a scorched earth approach to many of our industries took place, I think one of the key lessons we should share is that kind of brutal disruption took a very heavy toll on communities and families, and that whenever we're contemplating big changes, we should also be thinking about how we smooth transition, how we achieve a just transition, including in terms of greening our industries, that we've got to think of ways of minimizing the hurt to working families and local communities. Because the truth is, we are still dealing with the legacy of the 1980s in many of the towns that are going to be hit hardest by the COVID experience in terms of our economy. So, you know, I think one of the reasons, again, to get diverse voices around the table is to look at how can, even if I don't like it, you may like it, but if there is going to be change, how do we do it in a way that protects people as far as we can? And that's something I think that Labour has as a value, and I would like any government to have as a value.
Now, we've had a question from Anna Mowbray, and she asks, what do the panellists think can be done for cities, towns or regions, particularly those which have lost significant industries, to deliver new good jobs to those areas? This is drawing on a lot of what we've been talking about. She says retraining is important, but what can be done if there are no or not enough sufficient good employers in an area for people to retrain into? How can these be encouraged and created? I want to go to you first, Helen. A lot of people say tax incentives are part of that. Would you agree with that?
I think they can be part of it, but I think we know that they don't do enough, that by itself a tax incentive doesn't necessarily pull an employer to a particular area. But I think actually there are internationally quite a lot of good examples of particularly cities which have done this really successfully, which have put together a package of those kinds of incentives, but also the training package so that the employer won't face skills shortages. So that can be done very well for the private sector. But I think also some of the things like investing in adult social care or energy efficiency, these are things that are needed in every part of the country. We can choose to do them in ways that create good quality jobs, and we can choose to have an accompanying package of training and skills which will get people into those jobs. So I think that's one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is I don't want to see any infrastructure spending that doesn't have that package of employment support and skills along with it, which will get local people into those good jobs. But I think also what we see a lot is when you get a really good employer to an area, you don't necessarily have the people in that area with the skills and qualifications, so they don't benefit from it even when you succeed.
Yeah. And Darren, how do you think about this issue? Is it a sort of chicken and egg argument? You need the people with the skills to attract the employers, or do you need to incentivize the employers to come, then people get trained up? What's your thoughts?
It's not easy, right, doing this. We did an inquiry on the Science and Technology Committee in the last Parliament about how best to use the research and innovation budget for these types of issues. And there was some evidence that, as Helen said, you might spend a bit of money in opening a research institute or a centre in a particular part of the country. And then the academics that know how to do that essentially move there because they're incentivized to move there. But it doesn't really create the opportunities for people that live in the area if they're not really working in that space. So you can't just be kind of blunt about it. There has to be a sophisticated package. And the things that I would suggest is firstly, one, these decisions shouldn't be taken by Whitehall. I think Whitehall should set the parameters, but the decisions should be taken by local communities. And that's why we're looking at levelling up in the context of devolution next week on my committee, because, in my neck of the woods, I've got councillors, directly elected city mayor, the local enterprise partnership, the directly elected regional mayor, the West of England Combined Authority, the Western Gateway, which is our powerhouse that also links into Wales. So you've got the devolved administration, and then you've got Whitehall. And then you go to other parts in the southwest and they've got the local council. Now, I'm not saying one of those works and the other doesn't, but it's clearly incoherent. And we don't have enough devolution with a coherent infrastructure and governance model to empower regions and nations of the country to take these decisions in a way that Whitehall will just let them get on with it. And I do think that's a really important unlocking route to getting these decisions right, to work right for the local communities in which you're making the decisions.
And what if you could pick up on that, Francis? I mean, this government says it's committed to devolution. We haven't seen a huge amount of action yet. What's your sense about whether we are going to get that devolution of power?
I kind of think that maybe the government should be paying more attention to what's happening in Scotland and Ireland at the moment, and no doubt Wales too as time goes on. I mean, I have a kind of nuanced view on some of this, partly based on the experience of regional development agencies. The best of that being about it unleashing local creativity, some amazing big and long-term thinking in different regions, but the downside of it being regions competing against each other. I mean, literally, spending on advertising agencies to compete against each other to try and attract the same employer. And I always like to remind our unions that, inequality within any given region is at least as great as inequality between regions. So I think some of that kind of unhelpful pitting of as if London's all posh against the north, is not very good for us as a country, and certainly not good for us as working people. I think we also need to distinguish between the short term and the longer term, because I think there will be an urgency in many towns and rural areas, coastal areas, to have some jobs-rich initiatives. We need quality, but we also need numbers. So the sorts of firms that can deliver that might be different to some of the firms that we know will be strategically important and really important for our balance of trade or our future productivity, but won't necessarily deliver large numbers of jobs. So there is, there's some hard thinking about some of the choices that we'll face.
We've had a very interesting question from Ray Skinner, and he asks, what about soft, small loans to encourage self-employment? He says that in the early 1980s, after sponsoring a youth training scheme using a government grant, my North East Anglican parish used the ex-miners welfare hall we owned to encourage self-employment. I wonder if I can put this to you, Helen, because self-employment has in recent years become something of a negative thing, or at least it's associated with, insecurity, big falls in real terms, pay. But obviously some people, it works for them, works very well for them. How should we think about self-employment in the mix as we go forward and try and create good jobs and try and keep employment up?
So I think there's a couple of things. One is that I think you're right that self-employment it has become sometimes an excuse not to improve the rest of the labour market. So you can kind of say, well, this particular group doesn't seem to be doing very well getting good jobs, so we'll just help them become self-employed. And in quite a lot of instances, what you do is people end up just as stuck and trapped in self-employment, which doesn't really let them earn enough. And I remember looking particularly a few years ago at some ethnic minority groups that had very high levels of self-employment and trying to understand why. And at least part of that was because people were facing structural discrimination and disadvantage in the rest of the labour market, so they were pushed into self-employment. So I think self-employment has to be a pull thing, not a push thing. I also think there needs to be a lot more focus on quality. Again, if you look at the kind of support people get when they're trying to become self-employed, I'm not convinced many of it helps people to identify, is this business going to really become something I can live off? And what are the kind of management practices and all these other things which will help you be productive and have a thriving business? I don't think we're very good at that. I think we tend to give people a loan, leave them to get on with it, and then they sink or swim. And even if they're swimming, it can still trap you actually in a pretty difficult situation. So I think there is a place for it, but it's not the panacea to all the other problems. And that's sometimes how it comes across.
Yeah, I can see you nodding along with that, Darren. I mean, self-employment is, if we go back to the 1980s, one of those sort of iconic phenomenons, is that people sort of be entrepreneurs. But the evidence suggests that, as Helen was saying, that a very, very small minority of people who are self-employed actually are the entrepreneurs that are often talked about. So maybe you could just talk a bit more about how you and Labour are thinking about the self-employment issue in the as we go forward.
Sure. So just a couple of points. I mean, to start with the disclaimer, I'm a humble backbencher, so I can't speak on behalf formally of the Labour Party, but I'll share my views anyway. The first thing on self-employment is, I agree with Helen. I think there's been clear data that a lot of people who are self-employed, especially after the 2008 crisis, are in work, but not actually earning the minimum wage or earning very low incomes, and there's not much security or resilience around it. So there's an issue there about how you what rights self-employed workers have. The second point is linked to that because, of course, there's been rise in self-employment, which isn't actually self-employment. If you're an Uber driver or a Deliveroo cyclist, are you really self-employed? Probably not, in my view. And those people have been shown especially to be at risk. And so this whole debate about the kind of legal categories of work and how you put protections around that is really important. And the third point I'd say, before I say something positive, is I think there's a class issue here. I mean, I grew up in a council estate in my constituency. I had lots of ideas growing up of things I might like to do, and there were lots of other people that did as well, but you couldn't take the financial risk to start your own business because you didn't have, your parents couldn't give you any money. You probably couldn't live with them in some circumstances if you suddenly couldn't afford to pay your rent. And you've got bills to kind of pay for and you're stretched anyway. So how on earth in those circumstances can you say, oh, I'm going to take a loan, by the way, a loan from the government and start my own business? I mean, it's just, there's so many barriers to entry on self-employment that it tends to be, and I say this with the greatest respect, you see lots of great tech startup entrepreneurs who I think have done amazing things, but they generally come from wealthier backgrounds because that gives them the protection in order to try their ideas. And if it goes wrong, it's not entirely the end of the world for them. The last thing I would say is that, the idea of self-employment and innovation and going out and kind of doing new things should be a hugely exciting opportunity for the British economy. But for the reasons I've set out, it's very difficult to achieve that. And there's lots of things we can do, whether it's around government procurement, the way in which SMEs are able to bid for government contracts, which is still appalling, the way in which regional support comes forward for people, whether it's office space, so they're not having to think about rent for offices, whether it's about grants as opposed to loans, whether it's formulating partnerships with supply chains where there's going to be some guaranteed work that will allow you to innovate. There's lots of things there that you can do that other countries do much better than we do, including the United States, by the way, that we just haven't kind of got our hands around. And I think that's something that we should try to pursue in the Labour Party.
Thank you. Now we're coming to the end, but I just want to ask you, Francis, the 4-day working week is something we've talked about before, and obviously Labour talked about going into the last general election. How should we think about those issues now? Because obviously the context is very different, with a threatened collapse in employment rather than full employment. Is that something that we should still aspire to, but should it be pushed into the medium and long term? What's your thoughts?
So for our 150th anniversary, the TUC made a big call for let's look at the 4-day week. Let's look at shorter working time, but very much on the basis of we know that there are multi-billion-pound productivity gains that will be secured through new technologies, artificial intelligence, and so on. And let's look at how we share that, because when we've seen these big leaps before, workers have been locked out of a fair share of the rewards of big productivity gains. So that was kind of how we'd positioned the debate before. As you say, we're obviously in a very different position now, where certainly on a company by company basis, we've already come to agreements with lots of employers about how do we share the work that we have to maintain the fabric of the workforce, so that if and when things do pick up in 6 months or whenever we finally get a vaccine, that we'll be in a position to take full advantage of that and won't have wasted these precious skills and dumped human beings onto the scrap heap of redundancies. So I think it's still a very vibrant and real and practical debate and discussion between employers and unions. And I think it's important that we have that public conversation too, because I think, again, one of the things we've learned through this virus is the appetite there is amongst workers for a little bit more freedom, autonomy, and flexibility in the way that we work. How do we humanize work? So particularly at a time when a lot of childcare arrangements are still in shreds, when a lot of people genuinely feel worried about their own health issues or those of people they're sharing a home with, you know, this is kind of, I think there's even more reason why people are looking again for some rebalancing so that flexibility becomes a two-way street.
Yeah. And Darren, I mean, I could just ask you quickly, how was it on the doorstep talking about a 4-day week? Did it even come up? Is that an appealing thing? And how are you thinking about that issue in light of the new changed circumstances? Because some people might say, well, I've got a better work-life balance in some ways now. I'm not having to commute. Maybe they want things to remain that way.
Yeah, I think there's a short, medium and long-term answer to this question. I think the short-term question on a 4-day week is a very credible one, where we've seen, for example, industries say to the government, for example, in parts of the aerospace industry, like they have in Germany, we're not at full capacity, but we don't want to make staff redundant. So can we do a deal on the 5th day where maybe the government pays for it, or we all kind of contribute a little bit so that we can keep people in work actively for 4 days and kind of deal with that kind of drop off of the 5th. I think that's a perfectly sensible solution, not least because the Exchequer gets most of that money back anyway by having somebody in work paying income tax and national insurance and, you know, buying things. The medium term question is, as Francis has talked about, you know, this newfound joy of flexible working a little bit from home maybe, or from a closer location to your home, maybe going into the office or into the cities less frequently, I think will lead to this kind of desire for shorter working hours. And remember that the UK has disproportionately worked more hours than compared to European workers. This isn't shorter hours 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. It's shorter hours, probably more than that for many people. The longer term answer though is the one which we tried in the manifesto and didn't really kind of make sense to many workers because we're not quite there yet. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it's a longer term discussion, which, as Francis has talked about, you know, my point earlier on technological reform in order to increase productivity will mean that humans will have less to do. And actually that should be an opportunity to give us more time with our families and our communities, to be healthier and happier. But that productivity gain can't just be shared by the 3 or 4 tech giants at the top who provide all of the AI and software and cloud computing. Yeah. It needs to be shared with workers. And the only way in which you do that is by the government setting rules to get us to that 4-day week, but with then fair distribution of the proceeds of the productivity gains.
Yeah. And just finally, Helen, I mean, can we aspire to good jobs and also a good work-life balance as well? Should we be aiming for both?
I think we actually have to be, because one of the big problems is people who need to work flexibly, parents and carers, get stuck in low-paid jobs because we don't open up enough good quality job to part-time workers. That's something which I think would do far more for people's well-being and our national economy than the kind of 4-day week, which seems to me a bit more of a rhetorical device than an actual policy.
Very interesting. Well, we're coming towards the end. It's been a really stimulating discussion. We've covered an immense amount of ground, which I'm very pleased about. I think, sort of drawing some of the big themes together, I think government may have the rhetoric about rebalancing, levelling up, about retraining, about industrial strategy, but it's got to deliver on it. It doesn't mean anything unless they actually do the hard work of getting the mechanics right, getting the money where it's needed, and making these programs effective. And I really like Helen's point about management. I mean, this is so under discussed. Getting good managers to drive productivity gains and to drive good businesses is so important. And I think that what was stressed by Annalise as well and others was the opportunities that are out there. Helen made this point about green jobs, about care workers. There are areas where we know we need people, manpower, woman power, people power. We need these areas. So let's just get. There are big gains to be had. It's not all just a bleak vista. These are hard things to do. I think Darren made this point, but they are achievable, particularly if we learn the lessons from previous recessions. About focusing, not leaving areas behind, not having a sort of geographically blind approach, but also, and this is the fundamental point, focusing on good jobs, not just going for numbers, not just going for volume, but for quality as well. And I think that's come through very loud and clear. So with that, I just want to thank all our speakers, Annalise Dodds, Darren Jones, Francis O'Grady, and Helen Barnard of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and all people in the audience who very kindly sent in questions, some really good questions among them. Thanks so much to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation for organising this really important Fringe event, and thank you all so much for watching. Goodbye.